For 35 years, I poured my heart and soul into raising my son David. I was a single mother who worked double shifts, skipped meals, and sacrificed everything so he could have the best life possible. I put him through private school, paid for his college education, and even helped him buy his first house. But the day he looked me in the eye and called me useless, something inside me snapped. What he didn't know was that his useless mother had just inherited more money than he could ever imagine, and I was about to show him exactly how useless I really was. It all started on a rainy Thursday evening in October. I had just gotten home from my job at the law firm where I'd worked as a paralegal for the past 15 years. I was exhausted, my feet aching from standing all day, but I was excited because I had news to share with David and his wife, Jennifer. Earlier that week, I had finally received the official papers from my late aunt's estate. Aunt Margaret, my mother's sister, had passed away 6 months earlier, and I had just learned that she had left me her entire fortune, nearly $12 million. I had been living in David's guest house for the past 2 years, ever since I sold my own place to help him with his mortgage when he was going through financial difficulties. At the time, he and Jennifer were struggling with their business, and I didn't hesitate to liquidate my assets to help them. They promised it would be temporary just until they got back on their feet. That was 2 years ago. As I walked up the driveway to the main house, I could see David and Jennifer through the living room window. They were sitting on the expensive leather sofa I had helped them buy, watching their massive flat-screen TV that I'd also contributed to purchasing. I knocked on the door, clutching the envelope with the inheritance papers, my heart racing with excitement about sharing the good news. Jennifer opened the door, and immediately I could tell something was wrong. Her usual fake smile was replaced with a cold stare. "Oh, it's you," she said flatly. "David's in the living room." I followed her inside, trying to ignore the chill in her voice. David looked up from his phone when I entered, his expression darkening. "Mom, we need to talk," he said without any greeting. "Actually, I have some wonderful news to share with you both," I began, holding up the envelope. "You're not going to believe what's happened?" "No," David cut me off sharply, standing up from the sofa. "I said we need to talk, and I meant it. Sit down." Something in his tone made my stomach drop. This wasn't the conversation I had been expecting. I slowly took a seat on the chair across from them, the inheritance papers still clutched in my hands. "Mom," David began, his voice cold and distant, "Jennifer and I have been talking, and we've made a decision. We think it's time for you to find your own place." I blinked, certain I had misheard him. "I'm sorry, what?" Jennifer leaned forward, her voice equally cold. "We've been more than generous letting you stay in our guest house for 2 years, but we need our space back. We're planning to start a family soon, and we'll need that space for a nursery." "But, David," I said, my voice shaking, "this is only temporary, remember?" "Just until I got back on my feet after helping you with the mortgage." "Back on your feet?" David laughed bitterly. "Mom, let's be honest here. You're 58 years old, working a dead-end job that barely pays minimum wage. You sold your house to help us, which was your choice. But now you're basically homeless and dependent on us. That's not temporary, that's permanent." The words hit me like a physical blow. "David, I'm your mother. I gave up everything to raise you, to give you opportunities. And I'm grateful for that," he said, but his tone suggested otherwise. "But that doesn't mean I owe you a place to live for the rest of your life. You need to be realistic about your situation." Jennifer nodded in agreement. "David's right. You can't expect us to support you indefinitely. We have our own lives to think about, our own future to plan." I felt tears building in my eyes, but I forced them back. "Where exactly do you expect me to go? Do you have any idea how expensive rent is? On my salary, I can barely afford a studio apartment in a decent neighborhood." David shrugged callously. "That's not really our problem, is it? You're an adult, Mom. Figure it out." "Besides," Jennifer added with a smirk, "there are plenty of senior living communities that offer affordable housing. Maybe it's time to accept that you're getting older and adjust your expectations accordingly." I stared at them both in disbelief. These were the same people who had begged me for help just 2 years ago, who had promised that letting me stay in their guest house was the least they could do after I had given them my life savings. "David," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I am your mother. I worked 3 jobs to put you through school. I gave up dating, marriage, having more children. I gave up everything for you. How can you sit there and talk to me like I'm some kind of burden?" David's expression hardened even further. "Because that's exactly what you are, Mom. A burden. You made your choices, and now you have to live with the consequences. I never asked you to sacrifice everything for me. That was your decision. And frankly, Jennifer chimed in, it's getting embarrassing having you around. Our friends ask questions when they see you living in our guest house like some kind of charity case. It reflects poorly on us. The room fell silent except for the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I looked at my son, the child I had raised alone, the young man I had been so proud of, and I realized I was looking at a stranger. A cold, selfish stranger who saw his own mother as nothing more than an inconvenience. So when exactly do you expect me to be out? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady despite the turmoil inside me. End of the month, David said without hesitation. That gives you 2 weeks to find something. That's plenty of time. I stood up slowly, the inheritance papers still clutched in my hand. For a moment, I considered telling them about the money, about the fact that their useless mother had just inherited more wealth than they had ever dreamed of. But something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the sudden realization that I needed to see exactly who my son really was. Fine, I said quietly. I'll be out by the end of the month. David looked relieved. Good. I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. Reasonable? As if being kicked out by my own son was a reasonable thing to accept. Oh, and Mom, Jennifer added as I headed toward the door, when you're looking for a place, maybe consider something in a different neighborhood. This area is getting quite expensive, and we wouldn't want you to struggle financially trying to keep up with the property values here. I turned back to look at her, this woman who had benefited so much from my generosity, and smiled. Don't worry about me, Jennifer. I think I'll manage just fine. That night, I sat in the guest house that had been my home for 2 years, looking at the inheritance papers that would change everything. $12 million, more money than David and Jennifer could ever imagine, more money than they would see in several lifetimes. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made over the years. When David was 7 and wanted to play baseball, I worked extra shifts to pay for equipment and league fees. When he was in high school and wanted to go on a class trip to Europe, I took a second job to make it happen. When he wanted to attend an expensive private college, I worked 3 jobs and took out loans that I was still paying off. After he graduated, when he wanted to start his own business, I liquidated my retirement account to give him startup capital. When that business failed and he was facing bankruptcy, I sold my house, the house I had worked 20 years to pay off to save him. And this was how he repaid me, by calling me useless and throwing me out like garbage. But as I sat there in the darkness, a plan began to form in my mind. A plan that would show David and Jennifer exactly how useless his mother really was. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching real estate in their neighborhood. David and Jennifer lived in Willowbrook Estates, one of the most exclusive communities in the city. Their house, which I had helped them buy, was worth about $800,000. It was a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet street, lined with mature oak trees. What David and Jennifer didn't know was that the house directly next door to theirs, a massive Georgian mansion that had been empty for months, was available for rent. The asking price was $15,000 per month, which would have been impossible for most people, but for someone with $12 million in the bank, it was completely manageable. I called the real estate agent and arranged a viewing for that afternoon. The mansion was everything I had expected and more. It was nearly twice the size of David's house, with 6 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a grand foyer with a sweeping staircase, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked perfectly manicured gardens. The master suite alone was larger than most apartments, with a walk-in closet that could have served as a bedroom and a bathroom with a jetted tub that looked like something from a luxury spa. The previous tenants were a tech executive and his family, the agent explained as we toured the gourmet kitchen with its professional-grade appliances and marble countertops. They were relocated to Singapore for work, so the owners are looking for someone who can appreciate the quality and maintain the property appropriately. Money is no object, I told her. I can pay the full year upfront if necessary. Her eyes widened. That would certainly make you a very attractive candidate. May I ask what you do for work? I smiled. I'm recently retired. Early inheritance, I said simply. By the end of the week, I had signed the lease and arranged for movers. I had also done something else. I had hired an interior designer to furnish the mansion with the finest furniture and artwork money could buy. If I was going to do this, I was going to do it right. Meanwhile, I continued to act as if nothing had changed around David and Jennifer. I went to work each day, came home to the guest house each evening, and began quietly packing my belongings. They seemed relieved that I wasn't fighting their decision or making a scene. I'm proud of you for being so mature about this, Mom, David said one evening when I ran into him in the driveway. I was worried you might make this more difficult than it needed to be. Why would I make it difficult? I replied. You've made your feelings perfectly clear. 3 days before my supposed move-out date, the moving trucks arrived next door. David and Jennifer watched from their window as an army of professional movers began carrying expensive furniture into the mansion. I saw Jennifer's face pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with curiosity. That evening, David knocked on my door. Mom, do you know anything about who's moving in next door? There were moving trucks there all day? I shrugged. I have no idea. Why would I know anything about your neighbors? It's just strange timing, he said. That house has been empty for months, and suddenly someone's moving in right when you're moving out. Coincidences happen, I said simply. The next day was Saturday, and I had arranged for my own move to happen that morning. David and Jennifer stood on their front porch, watching as movers loaded my modest belongings into a small truck. I could see the satisfaction on their faces as they watched their burden finally being removed from their property. Where are you moving to, Mom? David asked as I supervised the loading. Oh, I found a nice little place, I said vaguely. Nothing fancy, but it'll do. Well, I hope you'll be happy there, Jennifer said with false sweetness. And don't be a stranger. You're always welcome to visit. I smiled at the irony of that statement. I'm sure I'll be seeing you around. After the movers left with my belongings, I got in my car and drove around the block, parking on a side street where I could watch the mansion without being seen. At exactly noon, a black luxury sedan pulled into the mansion's circular driveway. The driver got out and opened the rear door, and I stepped out, wearing an elegant black dress and designer sunglasses. I walked up to the mansion's front door as if I owned the place, which in a way I did for the next year. The key turned smoothly in the lock and I disappeared inside. Within minutes, I saw David and Jennifer rush out of their house and stand in their front yard, staring at the mansion in confusion. I watched from the mansion's living room window as they whispered frantically to each other, clearly trying to figure out what they had just witnessed. An hour later, my doorbell rang. Through the mansion's ornate front windows, I could see David and Jennifer standing on my front porch, looking nervous and confused. I let them wait for a full minute before opening the door. Can I help you? I asked coolly, as if I had never seen them before in my life. Mom? David's voice cracked. What? What are you doing here? I live here, I said simply. Is there something you need? Jennifer's mouth was hanging open. But how? I mean, this house. The rent on this place must be $15,000 a month, I finished for her. Yes, it's quite reasonable for a property of this caliber. David looked like he was going to be sick. Mom, I don't understand. This morning you were moving out of our guest house with a small truck, and now you're living in a mansion that costs more per month than most people make in a year. How is this possible? I smiled serenely. Would you like to come in? I was just about to have some tea in the conservatory. They followed me inside in stunned silence, their heads turning back and forth as they took in the opulent surroundings. The crystal chandelier in the foyer alone probably cost more than their monthly mortgage payment. I led them to the conservatory, a sun-filled room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the estate's gardens. I poured tea from an antique silver service into delicate china cups. Mom, David said, his voice barely above a whisper, I need you to explain what's happening here. 3 days ago, you were working as a paralegal and living in our guest house. Now you're serving tea in a mansion. None of this makes sense. I took a delicate sip of my tea before responding. Well, David, it's quite simple, really. Remember last Thursday when I came to your house with some news to share? News that you cut me off before I could deliver? His face went pale. What news? I had just received the final paperwork regarding my Aunt Margaret's estate. It seems she left me a rather substantial inheritance. Jennifer leaned forward eagerly. How substantial? I paused for effect, watching as they both held their breath. $12 million. The teacup slipped from David's hands and shattered on the marble floor. Jennifer made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a moan. 12 million? David whispered. But why didn't you tell us? I raised an eyebrow. I tried to, remember? But you were too busy calling me useless and throwing me out to listen. Mom, we didn't know, he stammered. Of course you didn't know, I said calmly, because you never bothered to ask. You just assumed that your useless mother, who had given you everything she had, couldn't possibly have anything of value to offer. Jennifer was frantically calculating in her head. $12 million. That's enough to buy several houses like yours, I finished. In fact, this mansion could be purchased outright for about $3 million. I'm just renting it because I haven't decided where I want to settle permanently yet. David looked around the conservatory with new eyes, seeing the expensive furniture, the original artwork, the imported marble. Mom, I made a mistake. I was stressed about money, about the business, and I took it out on you. But you have to understand. Oh, I understand perfectly, I interrupted. You understand that your mother, who sacrificed everything for you, was an embarrassment and a burden when you thought she was poor. But now that you know she's wealthy, suddenly you want to understand each other. Jennifer was practically vibrating with anxiety. Margaret, we had no idea about your financial situation. If you had known, you would have treated me with respect? I asked. You would have valued me as a person? How interesting. I was the same person this morning that I am right now. The only thing that's changed is your perception of my net worth. David stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. Mom, please. I know I said some horrible things, but I was under a lot of pressure. The business has been struggling, and Jennifer's been talking about starting a family, and I just felt overwhelmed. I didn't mean what I said about you being useless. Didn't you? I asked quietly. Because you seemed quite certain when you said it. In fact, I believe your exact words were that I was basically homeless and dependent, and that supporting me wasn't your problem because I needed to figure it out as an adult. Jennifer jumped in desperately. We were just concerned about our future, about having space for children. We never meant to hurt you. I laughed softly. Hurt me? Oh, my dear Jennifer, you didn't hurt me. You freed me. You showed me exactly what you both thought of me, and it was quite illuminating. What do you mean? David asked, though he looked like he already knew the answer wasn't going to be pleasant. I mean that for 35 years, I believed that being a good mother meant sacrificing everything for my child. I worked myself to exhaustion, gave up my dreams, my social life, my chance at love, all so you could have the best of everything. And what did it get me? A son who saw me as a burden and a daughter-in-law who was embarrassed by my presence. I stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the perfectly manicured gardens. But you know what? You were right about one thing. It was time for me to start thinking about my own life, my own future. So thank you for that. David followed me to the window. Mom, please. I know I screwed up, but we're family. This inheritance, it changes everything. We can work together, invest the money, maybe expand the business. I turned to face him, and for the first time in years, I felt completely calm and in control. David, let me be very clear about something. This inheritance doesn't change anything between us. It simply revealed what was already there. What do you mean? Jennifer asked nervously. I mean that your son just told me that this inheritance changes everything. Not that he realizes he was wrong to treat me badly. Not that he's sorry for calling me useless. Not that he values me as his mother. No, he's excited because now I'm financially useful to him again. David's face flushed red. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? I challenged. 3 days ago, you couldn't wait to get rid of me. You called me a burden and told me to figure out my own life. Today you want to work together and invest the money. What exactly has changed about me as a person, David? He opened his mouth to respond, but couldn't seem to find words. I'll tell you what's changed, I continued. Nothing. I'm still the same woman who raised you alone, who worked multiple jobs to give you opportunities, who liquidated her life savings to help you when you were in trouble. The only difference is that now you know I have money, and suddenly I'm valuable to you again. Jennifer stepped forward, her voice pleading. Margaret, please don't let pride get in the way of family. We made a mistake, yes, but we can fix this. We can be a real family again. I smiled sadly. We were never a real family, Jennifer. A real family doesn't throw out their elderly mother because she's inconvenient. A real family doesn't call their mother useless because she's not financially contributing enough. A real family doesn't get embarrassed by their mother's presence. But we can change, David said desperately. People make mistakes, but they can learn from them. I've learned from this. Have you? I asked. What exactly have you learned? He fumbled for words. I've learned that family is more important than money, that I should never have treated you the way I did. I shook my head. No, David, you've learned that your mother has money, and now you want access to it. If I had shown up today in a beat-up car moving into a studio apartment, would you be here apologizing? Would you be talking about working together and being a family? His silence was answer enough. That's what I thought, I said quietly. Jennifer tried a different approach. What about grandchildren? Don't you want to be part of your future grandchildren's lives? The question hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment my composure wavered. The thought of grandchildren, of little ones who might love me unconditionally, was almost enough to break my resolve. But then I remembered David's words. You're basically homeless and dependent on us. I remembered Jennifer's smirk when she suggested I move to a senior living community. I remembered the satisfaction on their faces as they watched me being removed from their property that morning. Let me ask you something, Jennifer, I said. What kind of grandmother do you think I would be to your children? Would I be the kind who's welcome at family dinners, or the kind who's tolerated because she might leave money to the grandkids? Would I be the grandmother who's loved for who she is, or the one who's valued for what she can provide? Jennifer didn't answer. Because I already know what kind of mother-in-law I am to you, I continued. I'm the kind who's an embarrassment when she's poor and suddenly interesting when she's rich. I'm the kind who's a burden when she needs help and an asset when she can provide it. Is that really the kind of grandmother you want for your children? David was crying now, actual tears streaming down his face. Mom, please. I love you. I've always loved you. I just made a terrible mistake. Do you love me, David? I asked gently. Or do you love the idea of having a mother with $12 million? I love you, he insisted. Money doesn't matter. Money doesn't matter, I repeated. Then you won't mind if I donate it all to charity. The look of panic that crossed both their faces told me everything I needed to know. I thought so, I said. Money doesn't matter unless someone else controls it. I walked back to the tea service and began clearing the broken cup from the floor. I think it's time for you both to leave now. Mom, wait, David said desperately. We can work this out. Just tell me what you want me to do to make this right. I straightened up and looked at him, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time in years. When had my sweet little boy become this desperate, grasping man? When had love become conditional on usefulness? What I want, I said slowly, is to go back in time and see if you would have thrown me out if you had known about the inheritance first. What I want is to know if you would have called me useless if you knew I had money. What I want is to understand how my own son became someone who values people based on their financial contribution to his life. That's not who I am, he protested. Isn't it? I challenged. Then prove it. Walk away from this house, forget about the money, and treat me with respect because I'm your mother, not because I'm wealthy. He stood there for a long moment, and I could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. Part of him wanted to do the right thing, but the larger part, the part that had been shaped by years of entitlement and selfishness, couldn't let go of the money. It's not that simple, he finally said. We have obligations, debts. The business is struggling, and we could really use some help. And there it was. The truth, finally spoken aloud. Get out, I said quietly. Mom, get out of my house. Now. Jennifer tugged on David's arm. Come on, she whispered. Yao, we should go. They headed toward the door, but David turned back one more time. This isn't over, Mom. You're still my mother, and I'm still your son. That has to count for something. I met his eyes steadily. You're right. You are still my son. And that's the most heartbreaking part of all of this. After they left, I stood in my beautiful conservatory, surrounded by luxury, feeling utterly alone. This wasn't the victory I had imagined. It's not that simple, he finally said. We have obligations, debts. The business is struggling, and we could really use some help. And there it was. The truth, finally spoken aloud. Get out, I said quietly. Mom, get out of my house. Now. Jennifer tugged on David's arm. Come on, she whispered. Yao, we should go. They headed toward the door, but David turned back one more time. This isn't over, Mom. You're still my mother, and I'm still your son. That has to count for something. I met his eyes steadily. You're right. You are still my son. And that's the most heartbreaking part of all of this. After they left, I stood in my beautiful conservatory, surrounded by luxury, feeling utterly alone. This wasn't the victory I had imagined. I had thought that showing them my wealth would feel triumphant, that proving them wrong would bring satisfaction. Instead, it just felt hollow. But as the days passed, I began to find peace in my decision. I established routines in my new home, learned to use the state-of-the-art kitchen, spent mornings reading in the library and afternoons painting in the art studio I had set up in one of the spare bedrooms. David and Jennifer tried various tactics to reconnect with me. They sent flowers, which I donated to a local hospital. They invited me to dinner, which I politely declined. David even showed up at my door one evening with a bottle of expensive wine and a photo album from his childhood, hoping to appeal to my maternal instincts. "Look at this one," he said, pointing to a picture of himself at age 8, gap-toothed and grinning. "Remember when you worked 3 jobs to pay for my baseball camp? You said it was worth it to see me so happy." "I remember," I said softly. "You were such a good mother, Mom, the best. And I was such a happy kid because of everything you did for me." I studied the photo, remembering that time in our lives. I had been exhausted constantly, surviving on coffee and determination, but seeing David's joy had made every sacrifice worthwhile. "What happened to that little boy?" I asked quietly. David looked confused. "What do you mean?" "That little boy in the picture, he was grateful for everything, happy with what he had. He never demanded more than I could give or made me feel bad for what I couldn't provide." "What happened to him?" David's face crumpled. "I don't know, Mom. I guess I grew up and got selfish. I started focusing on what I didn't have instead of appreciating what I did have." It was the first honest thing he had said to me in years. "I miss that little boy," I admitted. "I miss the son who hugged me when I came home from work instead of calculating how much money I brought in." "He's still here," David said desperately. "I'm still that little boy who loves his mother." I wanted to believe him. Every maternal instinct I had was screaming at me to forgive him, to invite him back into my life, to pretend that his cruel words had never been spoken. But I had learned something important about myself in the past few weeks. I deserve better than conditional love. "I need time, David," I told him. "I need time to figure out who I am when I'm not defined by what I can do for other people." "How much time?" he asked. "I don't know, maybe a lot." He left that night looking defeated, and I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for the relationship we had lost, and relief that I was finally prioritizing my own well-being. Over the following months, I began to discover who I was as an individual rather than just as David's mother. I took art classes, joined a book club, learned to play tennis. I made friends, real friends who knew nothing about my financial situation and liked me for who I was as a person. I also began volunteering at a local women's shelter, helping other women who had found themselves in situations where they had given everything to others and lost themselves in the process. It was there that I met Elena, a 45-year-old woman who had left in 6 months after moving into the mansion. I received a letter from David's lawyer. He was suing me for financial elder abuse, claiming that I was mentally incompetent and that someone was taking advantage of me. He wanted the court to appoint him as my financial guardian. I wasn't surprised. In fact, I had been expecting something like this. When manipulation and guilt trips don't work, the next step is often legal action. I hired the best attorney money could buy, a sharp woman named Patricia Goldman who specialized in family law and elder rights. She took one look at the case and laughed. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You're 58 years old, mentally competent, and financially independent. Your son has no legal standing to claim guardianship. This looks more like a money grab than a genuine concern for your welfare." The case was thrown out within a month, but not before it made local news. The headline read, "Son Sues Mother for Control of Inheritance." The article painted David in an extremely unflattering light, describing him as a greedy son attempting to steal his mother's inheritance through frivolous legal action. The public reaction was swift and harsh. David's business, which was already struggling, lost several major clients who didn't want to be associated with someone who would sue his own mother for money. Jennifer's social standing in the community plummeted as well, and she found herself excluded from the various charity boards and social clubs she had once been part of. But the real blow came when David's mortgage company, citing the negative publicity and concerns about his character, called in his loan early. Without the income from his failing business and facing a foreclosure notice, David had no choice but to put his house, the house I had helped him buy, up for sale. I learned about their financial troubles through my real estate agent, who mentioned that the house next door was going on the market. "It's unfortunate," she said. "Young couple seemed nice enough, but they're facing foreclosure. The bank is forcing a quick sale." I asked her to let me know when the house officially went on the market. 2 weeks later, she called me with the listing details. David and Jennifer were asking for $750,000, less than they had paid for it, and significantly less than what it had been worth before the scandal broke. I made an offer that same day, full asking price, cash, with a 30-day closing. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was buying the house that I had originally helped David purchase, using money from an inheritance he had tried to steal from me through legal action. The day of the closing, I arrived at the title company office wearing a simple black dress and my best poker face. David and Jennifer were already there, sitting across the conference table looking haggard and defeated. David's eyes widened when he saw me. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "I'm the buyer," I said simply, taking my seat. The color drained from Jennifer's face. "You're buying our house?" "It's a good investment property," I replied. "Excellent neighborhood, close to where I live. I plan to rent it out." The closing proceeded in uncomfortable silence. David and Jennifer signed document after document, legally transferring ownership of their home to me. When it was over, they walked out with a check that would pay off their mortgage and leave them with enough money to rent a small apartment for a few months. As they gathered their papers to leave, David stopped at my chair. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why are you doing this to us?" I looked up at him, this man who had once been my precious little boy, and felt only sadness. "I'm not doing anything to you, David. I'm doing something for me. I'm making a good investment. But you know we'll have to rent now. You know how hard this is for us?" "Yes," I said. "I imagine it's about as hard as it was for me when you threw me out and called me useless." He flinched as if I had slapped him. Jennifer stepped forward, her voice shrill with desperation. "What do you want from us? We've apologized. We've tried to make things right. What more can we do?" I stood up and gathered my papers. "You can learn to support yourselves without depending on other people's money. You can learn to value people for who they are, not what they can provide. You can learn that actions have consequences." "And if we learn those things?" David asked hopefully. "If we become better people, will you forgive us then?" I paused in the doorway and turned back to look at them one last time. "I've already forgiven you, David. Forgiveness isn't about you earning it. It's about me letting go of anger. But forgiveness doesn't mean trust, and it doesn't mean going back to the way things were." "So what does it mean?" he asked. "It means I hope you both find happiness and learn to be better people, but it doesn't mean I'm willing to put myself back in a position where I can be hurt by you again." With that, I walked out of the title company office and drove home, to my mansion, which now sat next to the house I had just purchased from my own son. The following months were peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I converted David's former house into a rental property, and within a week I had tenants, a lovely young family with 2 small children who reminded me of David when he was little. They kept the yard immaculate and filled the house with laughter and joy. David and Jennifer moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment across town. I heard through mutual acquaintances that David had taken a job as a sales associate at an electronics store, while Jennifer worked part-time at a dental office. It was honest work, and for the first time in their adult lives, they were truly supporting themselves without help from anyone else. I might have felt sorry for them if I hadn't remembered Jennifer's words about senior living communities and David's assertion that I was basically homeless and dependent. They were learning what it really meant to struggle, and perhaps that lesson would make them better people. About 8 months after the house sale, I was tending to my garden when I noticed a familiar figure standing at the edge of my property. It was David, but he looked different. Thinner, older, with worry lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He was holding something in his hands. An envelope, it looked like. I continued pruning my roses, pretending I hadn't seen him. If he wanted to talk to me, he could come to the door like a civilized person instead of lurking at the property line. Sure enough, a few minutes later, my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, David stood there looking nervous and uncertain, the envelope clutched in his hands. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. "David, I know you probably don't want to see me, but I have something for you. Something I should have given you a long time ago." I didn't invite him in, but I didn't close the door either. "What is it?" He held out the envelope with trembling hands. "It's the money, all of it. Every penny you gave us over the years, for the house, for the business, for everything. I've been keeping track, and I finally have it all." I looked at the envelope but didn't take it. "Where did you get this money?" "Jennifer and I have been working, saving every penny we could. We sold my car, sold Jennifer's jewelry, took second jobs. It took us 8 months, but we finally have enough to pay you back." "Why?" I asked. He looked confused. "Why what? Why are you giving this to me? What do you hope to accomplish? David's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like that 8-year-old boy in the photograph again. Because you were right about everything. I did use you. I did take advantage of your love. I treated you like a bank account instead of like my mother, and that was unforgivable. And now you want forgiveness? No, he said, surprising me. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just want to do the right thing, even if it's too late. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda, but all I saw was genuine remorse and exhaustion. Keep your money, David, I said finally. His face lit up with hope. Does that mean— It means you probably need it more than I do, I interrupted. And it means that what I wanted was never about money. It was about respect, about being valued as a person rather than an ATM. I do value you, he said earnestly. I know I didn't show it, but I do. You're the strongest, most generous person I know, and I spent so many years taking that for granted. What changed? I asked. What made you realize this? David sighed deeply. Living without you, struggling to pay bills, worrying about rent, working jobs I hate just to survive, it made me realize what you must have gone through all those years when you were working multiple jobs to support us, and seeing other families, normal families where children actually care about their parents. It made me realize how badly I had failed as a son. It also made you realize that I wasn't as useless as you thought. He winced. I never should have said that. Even if I believed it, which I don't anymore, I never should have said something so cruel to the woman who sacrificed everything for me. I leaned against the doorframe, suddenly feeling very tired. You know what the hardest part was, David? It wasn't losing my home or being called useless. It was realizing that I had failed as a mother. What do you mean? You were an amazing mother. No, I wasn't. If I had been, I would have raised a son who understood the value of kindness and gratitude. I would have raised a son who didn't measure people's worth by their bank accounts. Instead, I raised someone who could throw out his own mother without a second thought. David was crying now, tears streaming down his face. You didn't fail, Mom. I failed. You gave me everything, and I turned into an entitled, selfish person anyway. That's not your fault. That's mine. Maybe we both made mistakes, I said softly. Maybe. But yours were mistakes of love, and mine were mistakes of selfishness. There's a big difference. We stood there in silence for a few moments, both lost in thought. What happens now? David asked finally. I don't know, I admitted. I'm not the same person I was a year ago. I've learned to live for myself, to value my own happiness. I'm not sure there's room in that life for people who hurt me. I understand, he said quietly. I just want you to know that losing you, really losing you, has been the worst thing that's ever happened to me. Not because of the money, but because you were the only person who ever loved me unconditionally, and I threw that away. It wasn't unconditional, I corrected him. That was the problem. My love was conditioned on being needed, on being useful. I enabled your behavior by always being there to fix your problems and clean up your messes. David looked surprised. But that's what mothers do, isn't it? Good mothers teach their children to be independent and responsible. They don't create dependency by solving every problem. I thought I was being loving, but really I was being controlling. I made myself indispensable so you would need me. So what would a good mother do now? He asked. I smiled sadly. A good mother would let her adult son figure out his own life without interfering, whether that meant helping or hurting. And what would a good son do? A good son would respect his mother's boundaries and prove through his actions, not his words, that he had learned from his mistakes. David nodded slowly. So, if I stopped asking for forgiveness and just tried to be a better person, that would be more meaningful than anything I could say? Yes. And if I gave you space instead of trying to force a relationship, that would show more respect than showing up with flowers and apologies? Yes. David put the envelope back in his pocket. Then that's what I'll do. I'll give you space and I'll work on becoming the kind of man you could be proud to call your son. And if you do that, I said, maybe someday we can find a new kind of relationship. Not the old one where you needed me to solve your problems, and not the current one where we can't trust each other, but something new and healthier. I'd like that, he said, even if it takes years. It might, I warned him. That's okay. You're worth waiting for. After David left, I sat in my conservatory with a cup of tea, thinking about the conversation. For the first time in over a year, I felt a tiny spark of hope that maybe, someday, my son and I might find our way back to each other. But I also knew that I would never again put my own happiness aside for anyone else's benefit. I had learned too much about my own worth to go back to being the self-sacrificing martyr I had been before. 2 years passed. True to his word, David kept his distance, though I occasionally heard updates about his life through mutual friends. He and Jennifer were still together, still working regular jobs, still living modestly in their small apartment. More importantly, I heard that he had started volunteering at a literacy program, teaching adults to read. It was the first time in years that I had heard of him doing something that didn't directly benefit himself. Jennifer, I learned, had also changed. She had started a small business making handcrafted jewelry and was reportedly much humbler and kinder than she had been during her entitled years as David's wife. Some people, it seemed, really could learn from their mistakes. As for me, I had found a life I never knew I wanted. I traveled extensively, spending months in Europe and Asia, experiencing cultures and cuisines I had only read about before. I bought a small art gallery and began showcasing work by local artists. I continued volunteering at the women's shelter and even started a foundation that provided emergency financial assistance to women leaving abusive relationships. For the first time in my adult life, I was living for myself, and it was extraordinary. On a warm spring morning, exactly 3 years after I'd moved into the mansion, I was surprised to find a small package on my doorstep. There was no note, no return address, just a simple gift box tied with a white ribbon. Inside was a small frame photograph, the same picture David had shown me years earlier of his 8-year-old self at baseball camp, gap-toothed and grinning. But this time, there was something written on the back in David's handwriting. "Thank you for loving this little boy enough to sacrifice everything for his happiness. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what that really meant. I'm working every day to become someone worthy of that love. With gratitude and respect, David." I held the photograph for a long time, remembering that happy little boy and the woman I had been then. So tired, so overwhelmed, but so full of love and hope for the future. Maybe it was time to consider that future again. Not the old future where I defined myself through my usefulness to others, but a new one where love and respect could coexist with boundaries and self-worth. I picked up my phone and dialed David's number. It rang several times before he answered, and when he did, his voice was cautious. "Hello? David? It's me. It's Mom." There was a long pause. "Hi, Mom. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine. I got your package, the photograph. Thank you." "You're welcome. I wanted you to know that I think about that little boy sometimes, and I think about the mother who loved him so much. I'm trying to find my way back to being someone who deserves that kind of love." "Would you like to have coffee sometime?" I asked. "Just coffee. Nothing more." I could hear the hope and surprise in his voice. "I would like that very much." "There are conditions," I said firmly. "Of course, whatever you need." We talk about our lives as they are now, not about the past or what we wish things could be. We treat each other with respect as adults, and if either of us feels uncomfortable or needs space, we say so honestly without guilt or manipulation. "I understand." "And David, this is not about forgiveness or going back to the way things were. This is about seeing if we can build something new and healthier." "I understand that too, Mom. And I want you to know I don't need anything from you. I don't want your money. I don't need you to solve my problems. I just miss having my mother in my life." It was exactly what I needed to hear. We met the following Saturday at a small cafe downtown, neutral territory where neither of us had any history or baggage. David arrived early and was waiting for me when I walked in, and I was struck by how different he looked. He was still thin, still showed the stress lines of the past few years, but there was something calmer about him, more settled. We ordered coffee and sat across from each other, both uncertain how to begin. "You look good, Mom," David said finally. "Happy." "I am happy," I replied. "Happier than I've been in years." "I'm glad. You deserve to be happy." We talked for 2 hours about safe topics, my travels, his job, the weather, current events. It was pleasant and polite, like a conversation between friendly acquaintances rather than mother and son, but it was a start. As we prepared to leave, David hesitated. "Would it be okay if we did this again sometime? Same conditions, same boundaries?" I considered the question carefully. "Yes, I think I'd like that." And slowly, carefully, over many months of coffee dates and cautious conversations, we began to build something new. It wasn't the relationship we had before, that one had been too unbalanced, too unhealthy to ever fully restore. But it was something better, a relationship between two adults who respected each other's boundaries and valued each other's happiness. David never asked for money, never hinted at wanting help with his problems. When he mentioned challenges in his life, it was the way any adult might share concerns with a friend, not the way a child demands that a parent fix everything. And I never offered to solve his problems or rescue him from difficulties. When he talked about struggles at work or financial pressures, I listened and offered emotional support, but I didn't pull out my checkbook or offer to make phone calls on his behalf. It was a healthier dynamic than we had ever had, and it felt sustainable in a way our old relationship never had. Jennifer and I also found a new equilibrium. She apologized sincerely for her past behavior and never asked for anything more than basic politeness. We would never be close, but we could coexist peacefully at family gatherings. 5 years after moving into the mansion, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I sold the mansion and moved to a modest but comfortable house in the mountains, about 2 hours away from the city. It had a beautiful view, a cozy fireplace, and a garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers. The mansion had served its purpose. It had given me the space and time I needed to discover who I was when I wasn't defined by others' needs. But it had never felt like home. It was a statement, a symbol, a necessary step in my journey to self-respect. But it wasn't where I wanted to spend the rest of my life. My new house was smaller, simpler, more authentic to who I had become. I furnished it with pieces I loved rather than pieces that impressed others. I filled it with books and art and the sounds of classical music. I made friends with my neighbors, joined the local hiking club, and continued my volunteer work with women who needed support. David visited occasionally, making the drive up the mountain to spend a weekend helping me with household projects or just talking on the porch. These visits were some of the happiest times we had shared since he was a child, but they were different now, based on mutual choice rather than obligation, on respect rather than dependency. One evening, as we sat watching the sunset from my porch, David said quietly, "I need to tell you something, Mom." "What's that?" "Jennifer's pregnant. We're going to have a baby." My heart skipped a beat, a grandchild. After all these years, after everything that had happened, I was going to be a grandmother. "Congratulations," I said, and meant it. "How are you feeling about it?" "Terrified," he admitted with a laugh. "But excited, too. I keep thinking about what kind of father I want to be, what kind of man I want my child to see when they look at me." "And what kind of man is that?" "The kind who puts his family first without losing himself. The kind who teaches his children to be grateful and kind and independent. The kind who values people for who they are, not what they can provide." He paused. "The kind of man I should have been for you." I reached over and squeezed his hand. "You're becoming that man now. That's what matters." "I was wondering," he said hesitantly, "if you would want to be involved in the baby's life, not as a babysitter or a bank account, just as a grandmother who loves her grandchild." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through my chest that I hadn't experienced in years. I would love that very much. Even after everything that happened between us? Especially after everything that happened between us. We both learned important lessons about love and respect and boundaries. Our grandchild will benefit from having grandparents who understand the difference between helping and enabling, between love and dependency. David nodded thoughtfully. "I want to raise my child differently than I was raised. Not because you were a bad mother, but because I want to break the cycle of entitlement and selfishness." "How will you do that?" "By teaching them that love isn't measured by what you receive, but by what you give. By showing them that respect is earned through actions, not demanded because of relationships. By making sure they understand that everyone, including their grandmother, deserves to be valued for who they are as people." I felt tears building in my eyes, but they were good tears, healing tears. That sounds like a wonderful way to raise a child. 8 months later, I held my granddaughter Emma for the first time, and I understood that this was what redemption looked like. Not a return to the past, but a chance to build something better for the future. Emma was perfect, tiny fingers, bright eyes, and a peaceful expression that reminded me of David when he was a baby. But as I held her, I felt something I had never experienced with David. Complete, unconditional love with no strings attached, no hidden agendas, no expectations of what she might do for me in return. "She's beautiful," I whispered. David and Jennifer watched nervously as I cradled their daughter, probably wondering if I would try to take over, try to control the situation the way I had when David was growing up. Instead, I held Emma for a few precious moments, then handed her back to Jennifer. "Thank you for letting me meet her." "Would you like to hold her longer?" Jennifer offered. "No, she belongs with her parents. I'm just honored to be included." I visited once a month, always calling ahead, always respecting their routines and parenting decisions. I brought age-appropriate gifts, books, simple toys, clothes, but never anything extravagant or overwhelming. When they asked for advice, I gave it gently. When they didn't ask, I kept my opinions to myself. It was a completely different kind of grandmotherhood than I had imagined, but it was healthy and sustainable. Emma would grow up knowing she had a grandmother who loved her unconditionally, but who also respected boundaries and supported her parents' authority. As Emma grew from a baby into a toddler, I watched David become the father he had promised to be. He was patient and kind, firm but loving, and he clearly adored his daughter without spoiling her. Jennifer, too, had blossomed into a devoted mother who balanced affection with appropriate limits. They were better parents than I had been, and that filled me with pride rather than regret. They had learned from my mistakes and their own, and they were breaking the cycle of dysfunction that had nearly destroyed our family. One day, when Emma was 2 years old, she was playing in my garden while David and I watched from the porch. She toddled over to me with a handful of dandelions she had picked. "Gamma," she said, offering me the weeds as if they were the most precious flowers in the world. I accepted them graciously, tucking one behind my ear and putting the rest in a small vase. "Thank you, sweetheart. They're beautiful." David watched this interaction with a smile. "She loves you, you know." "I love her too. But it's different than it was with us, isn't it?" I considered his question carefully. "Yes, it's different. With you, my love was tangled up with fear and control and need. I loved you desperately, but I also needed you to need me. With Emma, I just love her. Period. No strings attached." "Do you think that makes you a better grandmother than you were a mother?" "I think it makes me a healthier person," I replied. And healthy people make better family members, whether they're mothers or grandmothers or anything else. As the sun set behind the mountains, I reflected on the long journey that had brought me to this moment. From a desperate single mother working multiple jobs, to a woman who defined herself entirely through her usefulness to others, to someone who was discarded when that usefulness was no longer valued, to a person who finally learned to value herself. It had been a painful journey, full of heartbreak and loss and difficult truths. But it had also been necessary. Without losing everything, I never would have found myself. Without being called useless, I never would have discovered my own worth. David had been right about one thing, years ago, when he threw me out. It was time for me to be realistic about my situation. He just had no idea what that really meant. Being realistic meant recognizing that I deserved respect and kindness. It meant understanding that love should never require the complete sacrifice of one's own identity. It meant learning that being needed and being valued are two very different things. It meant discovering that the opposite of useless isn't useful. It's worthwhile. And I'd finally learned that I was worthwhile, with or without money, with or without someone to take care of, with or without anyone else's approval. As Emma fell asleep in my arms that evening, her tiny hand clutching my finger, I whispered a promise to her. "I will love you completely, but I will never lose myself in that love. I will support you and guide you, but I will never make you responsible for my happiness. And I will teach you by example that you are valuable simply because you exist, not because of what you can do for others." It was a promise I wished someone had made to me when I was young, and it was a promise I intended to keep. The mansion next door, the one that had started this whole journey, had been sold to a young family with children. Sometimes, when I visited David and Jennifer, I could hear those children laughing in the backyard, filling the space with joy and innocence. It was a good ending to that chapter of the story. The house that had represented anger and revenge had become a home filled with love and laughter. And the woman who had once used it to prove her worth had learned that her worth didn't need proving at all. Sometimes David asked me if I regretted buying the mansion, if I thought it was an extreme reaction to his cruelty. "No," I always told him. "I don't regret it. It was exactly what I needed to do at the time." Even though it was kind of vindictive? "Especially because it was vindictive," I would reply with a smile. "For once in my life, I put myself first. I prioritized my own feelings over everyone else's comfort. It was probably the healthiest thing I had ever done." And it was true. The mansion had been my declaration of independence, my way of saying that I mattered, that I had value, that I would not be discarded without consequences. It had been dramatic and expensive and probably unnecessary, but it had also been healing. Now, sitting in my cozy mountain home with my granddaughter sleeping peacefully in my arms, I understood that the real victory hadn't been proving David wrong about my worth. It had been proving it to myself. I was not useless. I was not a burden. I was not valuable only for what I could provide to others. I was Margaret Turner, a woman who had learned to love herself as much as she loved others, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.